I still hear her voice sometimes, late at night, when the wind whistles through the cracks of my apartment window. It's been years, but I can't forget what happened to Adisa. I was only a teenager then, but the memory is burned into my mind like a scar. It all started in our neighborhood, a crowded part of the city where the streets were always alive with noise. Life was fast-paced, but we had our share of mysteries. My grandmother always warned us about the spirits that lingered in the shadows of the city. She said they were restless, always looking for ways to cross into our world. But none of us really believed it until Adisa. Adisa was my cousin, and she was the most beautiful girl in our neighborhood. She had a laugh that could light up the darkest alley, and everyone loved her. But she was also stubborn. She never listened to warnings, especially not the ones about the old, abandoned buildings downtown. One evening, Adisa came back from hanging out with her friends, and she was different. Her eyes were distant, like she was seeing something we couldn't. She smiled to herself, a strange, secretive smile that made my skin crawl. When I asked her what was wrong, she just said, "I met someone." At first, we thought it was a boy from another part of the city. Adisa had always been popular, and it wasn't unusual for her to have admirers. But then, things started to get weird. Adisa would disappear for hours, sometimes all night. When she came back, she looked pale and tired, like she hadn't slept. Her mother tried to talk to her, but Adisa just said she was in love and that we wouldn't understand. She started spending less time with her friends and more time alone, staring out the window at the city lights. My grandmother noticed the change in Adisa before anyone else. She pulled me aside one evening and said, "Something is not right with that girl. She has the look of someone who has seen a spirit." I laughed it off at first, but deep down, I was worried. That night, I heard Adisa sneak out of the apartment. I followed her, my heart pounding as I watched her walk down the empty streets. She moved like she was in a trance, her steps slow and deliberate. Adisa led me to an old, abandoned building on the edge of the city. It was a place we had always been warned to stay away from. The windows were broken, and the walls were covered in graffiti. I stayed hidden, watching as Adisa walked inside. The building was dark, but I could see a faint light coming from one of the upper floors. I wanted to call out to her, to tell her to come back, but something stopped me. The air felt heavy, like the building itself was alive. I crept inside, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The light grew brighter as I climbed the stairs, and I could hear voices, Adisa's and another, deeper voice. When I reached the top floor, I saw him. At first, I thought it was a man. He was tall and handsome, with skin that shimmered like moonlight. But when he turned to look at me, I knew he wasn't human. His eyes were black, like two endless pits, and his smile was too wide, too sharp. Adisa turned to me, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "This is him," she said, her voice soft and dreamy. "He's my husband now." I wanted to scream, to run and pull her away, but I couldn't move. It was like my feet were rooted to the ground. The spirit reached out to Adisa, and she took his hand without hesitation. They walked deeper into the building, disappearing into the shadows. I stood there, frozen, until the light faded and the building was silent once more. The next morning, Adisa was back in the apartment, but she wasn't the same. Her eyes were empty, and her skin was cold to the touch. She wouldn't eat or speak, just sat by the window, staring at the city skyline. Her mother begged her to tell us what happened, but Adisa just smiled a strange smile and said, "I'm married now." We searched the city for days, but there was no trace of the spirit or the building Adisa had taken me to. It was like they had vanished into thin air. My grandmother said the spirit had taken Adisa, that she was his bride now, and we would never see her again. But sometimes, on quiet nights, I hear her voice calling from the streets below. It's soft and sad, like she's trying to tell me something. I never go to look, though. I know better now. The spirits are real, and they're always watching. The nights grew longer, and the city felt darker. I started hearing Adisa's voice more often, not just in my apartment but on the streets too. It was faint, like a whisper carried by the wind. Sometimes, I turn a corner and swear I saw her shadow disappearing into an alley. My friends noticed I was acting strange. They'd ask me why I looked so tired, why I jumped at every sound. I couldn't tell them the truth. They'd think I was crazy. But I knew what I saw, and I knew Adisa was still out there, somewhere. One evening, as I walked home from school, an old woman stopped me in the street. Her eyes were cloudy, and her voice was raspy. "You've seen them, haven't you?" she said. "The ones who walk between worlds." I froze. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I already knew. She grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Stay away from the old places," she warned. "They are watching you now." Before I could ask more, she disappeared into the crowd. I found Adisa's journal hidden under her bed. It was filled with sketches of the spirit, his sharp smile, his glowing eyes. The last entry was dated the night she disappeared. It read, "He says we'll be together forever. I'm not afraid anymore." The words sent chills down my spine. I flipped through the pages, looking for clues, but there was nothing else. Just drawings and cryptic notes about the city's secrets. One night, I saw it again, the abandoned building. It stood at the edge of the city, its windows glowing with that same faint light. I knew I shouldn't go back, but I had to find Adisa. I crept inside, my heart pounding. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the walls seemed to close in around me. I could hear voices upstairs, faint and echoing. I reached the top floor and saw Adisa standing in the center of the room. The spirit was there too, his black eyes fixed on her. They were surrounded by strange symbols drawn on the floor in what looked like ash. Adisa turned to me, her eyes glowing. "You shouldn't have come," she said. Before I could respond, the spirit raised his hand, and the room went dark. I woke up in my bed, drenched in sweat. At first, I thought it was a dream, but my clothes were covered in dust, and my hands were stained with ash. I didn't tell anyone what happened. They'd never believe me. But I knew I had to find a way to save Adisa before it was too late. I spent days at the library, searching for anything about spirits and urban legends. I found stories about people who had disappeared, just like Adisa. They all had one thing in common: they'd been seen near the abandoned building. One book mentioned a spirit who preyed on the lonely, offering them love in exchange for their souls. It said the only way to break his hold was to destroy his anchor, the place where he crossed into our world. I decided to go back to the building, but this time, I'd be prepared. I gathered salt, iron, and a few other things the book said could ward off spirits. My grandmother noticed what I was doing and pulled me aside. "You can't fight them alone," she said. "But if you must go, take this." She handed me a small, carved wooden charm. "It will protect you." I went back to the building at midnight, the charm clutched in my hand. The light was there again, flickering like a dying flame. I stepped inside, my heart racing. The symbols were still on the floor, but they looked faded, like someone had tried to erase them. Adisa was there, standing in the center of the room. The spirit stood behind her, his hand on her shoulder. "You shouldn't have come back," he said, his voice echoing in the empty space. I held up the charm, and he recoiled, his black eyes narrowing. "Let her go," I said, my voice shaking. The spirit lunged at me, but I threw the salt, and he hissed, backing away. Adisa stood frozen, her eyes blank. I grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the door. The spirit screamed, and the building shook, but I didn't stop. We made it outside just as the building collapsed, crumbling into dust. Adisa collapsed in my arms, her eyes finally clear. "What happened?" she asked, her voice weak. Adisa didn't remember much, just fragments of dreams and shadows. She was different, quieter, more reserved, but she was alive. The city tore down the remains of the building, and life went on. But I knew the spirit wasn't gone forever. The old woman found me again, her eyes sharp. "You did well," she said. "But he'll be back. They always come back." I nodded, knowing she was right. Adisa and I grew closer after that, bound by the secret we shared. But the city felt different, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Strange things started happening again, lights flickering, whispers in the dark. I knew the spirit was trying to return. I started gathering supplies again, determined to be ready this time. Adisa helped, though she was still haunted by what had happened. The spirit returned one stormy night, his form flickering like a dying flame. Adisa and I stood together, ready to face him. The battle was fierce, but in the end, we managed to banish him for good this time. But it came at a cost. Adisa was injured, her strength fading. Adisa survived, but she was never the same. The experience left her with scars, both physical and emotional. Years later, I still hear voices calling for Adisa sometimes, late at night. But now, it's a reminder of what we survived, and what we lost. The city moves on, but I know the spirits are still out there, waiting. And I'll be ready. Thank you, please subscribe, like and comment.